Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Dane Hall thought he had found the perfect home, quiet, spacious, free from chaos. But when the HOA refused to fix the crumbling road and instead targeted him with bogus fines and threats, he realized this wasn't just negligence, it was a racket. They wanted a fight? They had no idea who they were messing with. Dane Hall had always prided himself on making calculated decisions, both in his career and personal life. After years of working as a military engineer, where precision and foresight meant the difference between success and disaster, he finally retired and settled down in a quiet Texas suburb. His house, a spacious, well-maintained property on the edge of a once thriving neighborhood, was supposed to be his sanctuary, with a large front yard, a garage big enough for his truck, and just enough space between neighbors to ensure privacy. It was everything he had wanted. But the road leading to his house? That was another story entirely. When Dane had first moved in, the streets were in decent shape. Nothing luxurious, but functional. Over the years, however, the asphalt had cracked, and potholes had formed deep enough to rattle the suspension of even the toughest vehicles. Every time it rained, the holes filled with muddy water, creating deceptive traps that could wreck tires in an instant. Neighbors complained, frustrated at the HOA's refusal to act, but nothing changed. Dane wasn't the type to whine. He was a man of action, but no amount of DIY fixes could repair a road falling apart at the seams. At first, he assumed it was simple negligence. Maybe the Homeowners Association, HOA, had budget constraints or bureaucratic red tape to cut through before funding the repair. But when he attended his first HOA meeting, he realized the ugly truth. The HOA had money. A lot of money. It just wasn't being spent where it mattered. The president of the HOA, Robert Bob Langley, a smug real estate developer in his late 50s, had other priorities. Instead of fixing the roads, the funds had gone into aesthetic improvements, brand new entrance signs, ornamental fountains, and decorative street lamps. According to Bob, these were necessary investments to maintain property values. Meanwhile, the road to Dane's house looked like a battlefield. When Dane stood up at the meeting and voiced his concerns, Bob barely spared him a glance. "We have a scheduled plan for infrastructure improvements," Bob said in his usual condescending tone. "But we have other priorities at the moment. Landscaping projects, community event funding, and the new HOA office space renovation all come first." Dane clenched his jaw. A new office space? Meanwhile, residents were dodging craters in the pavement just to get home. It didn't add up. "So what's the timeline for road repairs?" Dane pressed, crossing his arms. Bob flashed a thin, knowing smile. "Next year, maybe." The response wasn't just dismissive, it was calculated. The HOA had no intention of fixing the roads, not anytime soon. They wanted to funnel funds elsewhere, and Bob clearly expected Dane to sit back and accept it. Dane felt a familiar heat of anger rising in his chest. He had spent years solving complex engineering problems under pressure. He wasn't about to be stonewalled by some self-serving bureaucrat in a polo shirt. Leaving the meeting, he knew one thing for certain. Bob Langley had just made a serious mistake. Dane wasn't going to let this go. And if the HOA wanted a fight, they had just picked the wrong man. Dane had dealt with stubborn bureaucrats before. He knew that if he wanted the HOA to take action, he had to become their biggest problem. But what he hadn't anticipated was just how quickly Bob Langley and his cronies would retaliate. It started subtly. A notice on his door, a warning about excessive weeds in his front yard. Dane frowned. His lawn was meticulously maintained. There wasn't a single overgrown patch. He ignored it, assuming it was some clerical mistake. Then came the second violation, this time for unauthorized vehicle storage. He found the paper pinned to his mailbox, stating that his truck, parked neatly in his own driveway, was in violation of the HOA's neighborhood aesthetic policy. It was absurd. Half the neighborhood owned trucks and none of them were being fined. Dane wasn't naive. This wasn't about the yard or his truck. This was punishment for challenging Bob Langley. But the harassment didn't stop there. A few days later, his mailbox was mysteriously knocked over. At first, Dane thought maybe a careless driver had clipped it, but when he checked his security camera footage, he saw a hooded figure smashing it with a bat around 2 a.m. No license plate, no clear face, just a shadow in the night. Then, things escalated further. One evening, he came home to find a bright orange tow sticker slapped onto the windshield of his truck. warning that it was scheduled for removal due to repeated violations. Dane tore it off and stormed inside, already dialing the HOA office. A receptionist, sounding painfully uninterested, told him that he had been reported multiple times and that the HOA had the right to escalate enforcement. "Who reported me?" Dane demanded. "I'm not authorized to share that information," the woman said in a robotic tone. Dane gritted his teeth. They weren't even hiding it anymore. This was a coordinated effort to make his life miserable. The final straw came 2 days later. Dane stepped outside one morning and saw a bright yellow violation sign staked into his front yard. Notice of fines and mandatory compliance. Property maintenance violations must be addressed within 72 hours. It was laughable. His property was pristine. The HOA had fabricated violations just to bury him in fines. Dane exhaled slowly. He wasn't the type to lose his temper, but this was a declaration of war. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, Dane was about to play smarter, harder, and far more ruthlessly than they could ever expect. Dane wasn't a man who took well to being bullied. If the HOA thought they could pressure him into backing down with fabricated fines and petty intimidation, they had made a grave miscalculation. The first thing he did was document everything. He took high-resolution photos of his property, his immaculate lawn, his properly parked truck, his freshly painted mailbox. He printed out copies of every violation notice, highlighting the absurdity of the claims. Then he dug into the HOA's own rulebook, looking for contradictions and legal loopholes they might have ignored in their attempt to harass him. And that's when he found the first crack in their armor. The HOA's bylaws stated that any fines issued must be based on a formal complaint from a resident and verified with photographic evidence. Yet, when Dane requested proof of the alleged violations, the HOA office refused to provide any. That meant one thing: they were making it up as they went. Dane wasn't going to fight this battle alone. He started talking to neighbors, quietly at first, finding out who else had been targeted. What he discovered was infuriating. Several homeowners, mostly those who had voiced complaints against Bob Langley in the past, had been dealing with similar nonsense fines. Some had been forced to pay hundreds, even thousands, just to stop the harassment. It wasn't just negligence, it was a racket. That's when Dane decided to take things up a notch. First, he filed a formal request for the HOA's financial records. According to Texas law, as a homeowner in the community, he had the legal right to review where his money was going. The moment his request was submitted, the HOA's attitude shifted. Suddenly, emails went unanswered. Calls were ignored. The office claimed there were delays in processing paperwork, a blatant stalling tactic, but Dane had already anticipated that. So he hired a private investigator. It was a former military buddy of his, someone who specialized in financial forensics. Within a week, the man uncovered something big. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into maintenance projects that never actually happened. Road repairs, never scheduled. Landscaping costs, triple the real price. And the kicker: a suspicious contract signed between the HOA and a consulting firm that just so happened to be registered under Bob Langley's wife's name. It was fraud. Plain and simple. Dane now had leverage, but he wasn't about to stop there. Late one night, he installed a network of security cameras around his property, hidden but strategically placed. And sure enough, it paid off. Within days, he caught a man in a dark hoodie sneaking onto his property and dumping a bag of trash on his lawn, the same trash he knew would result in yet another fine from the HOA. The next morning, Dane marched straight into the HOA office, laptop in hand. When the receptionist saw the video footage he played, her face turned pale. "I need to speak to Bob Langley," Dane said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "He's unavailable," she stammered. Dane gave her a slow, knowing smile. "That's fine. I'll let my lawyer talk to him instead." The war had just begun, and Dane was about to go on the offensive. Dane knew he had landed a direct hit on Bob Langley and his corrupt HOA board. The moment he walked out of that office with his laptop in hand, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The once smug board members stopped making eye contact when they saw him. The usual HOA notices stopped arriving, at least for a while. But it didn't last. If Dane had thought that exposing financial fraud and catching HOA lackeys on camera would make them back off, he was dead wrong. They were about to escalate the fight to a whole new level. It started a few nights later. Dane was in his garage when he heard a metallic clang from his driveway. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside and spotted something glinting in the dim light. A beer bottle smashed near the front tire of his truck, and next to it, an empty bag of marijuana carelessly tossed into his flower bed. Dane's stomach tightened. This wasn't random littering. Someone had planted it there. His gut told him to check the security footage, and when he did, his suspicions were confirmed. At 3:47 a.m., a hooded figure crept up to his driveway, dumped the trash, and scurried off. Dane rewound the footage, zoomed in on the shaky camera feed, and caught a brief glimpse of the culprit's face. One of Bob Langley's enforcers, a man named Jerry Miller, who had been on the HOA board for years. Dane clenched his fists. "You idiots are getting sloppy." The next morning, before Dane could even think about how to use the footage, he heard a sharp knock on his front door. He opened it to find two uniformed police officers standing on his porch. "Mr. Hall, we received a report that there have been incidents of public intoxication and drug use on your property." Dane almost laughed. They were trying to frame him. He stepped back, arms crossed. "Go ahead, officers. Look around. Do you see any signs of that?" One of the cops, a younger guy with a skeptical look, glanced at his spotless front yard and narrowed his eyes. "We're going to need to take a look around," the older cop said. Dane nodded. "Be my guest. Just know that you're on camera." He led them straight to his security system, where he pulled up the footage of Jerry Miller sneaking onto his property. The younger cop exhaled sharply. "Well, this changes things." The older officer shot Dane a look. "You want to press charges for trespassing?" Dane hesitated for just a second. If he acted too soon, he'd lose his element of surprise. Instead, he smiled. "Not yet, but I'll let you know if I do." The failed police setup didn't deter the HOA. Within the next 48 hours, they came back harder than before. 1. A sudden hike in his HOA fees, an unexplained adjustment that nearly tripled his monthly dues. 2. More fabricated violations, this time claiming his roof shingles were not HOA compliant. 3rd, an official notice stating that his house would be subject to external inspections by an HOA-appointed committee. Dane could feel it now, the desperation in their tactics. They weren't just trying to fine him into submission anymore. They were trying to force him out. The final straw came when Dane found a plain white envelope taped to his front door. No official HOA letterhead, no signature, just a single typed sentence on a piece of paper. "Walk away while you still can." Dane stared at the words for a long moment, his pulse steady, his mind razor sharp. The HOA thought they were dealing with an average homeowner, someone they could harass into selling, someone they could break with fines and red tape. They were wrong. This was no longer a dispute about a road. This was war, and Dane was about to make them regret ever picking a fight with him. Dane had spent years handling high-stakes operations in the military, where success depended on strategy, precision, and knowing exactly when to strike. The HOA had spent months trying to bully him into submission, but now they had made a fatal mistake. They had threatened him directly. And Dane? Dane didn't do well with threats. The moment he read the anonymous threat note, Dane knew the HOA was running out of options. Their fabricated fines hadn't worked. Their attempt to frame him with the police had failed, and now they were resorting to straight-up intimidation. That meant one thing. They were scared, and they had every reason to be. Dane had everything he needed to bury them. He had security footage proving that Bob Langley's cronies had trespassed on his property, financial records showing massive misappropriation of HOA funds, signed witness statements from neighbors detailing their own harassment and fraudulent fines. A full timeline of events carefully documented and supported with hard evidence. But just exposing the truth wasn't enough. He needed to make sure the fallout was nuclear, something that would obliterate Bob Langley's reputation and make it impossible for the HOA to cover up their corruption. So he went for a full-scale public takedown. Dane reached out to several local journalists, feeding them a treasure trove of documents, video evidence, and first-hand testimonies. When reporters realized they were sitting on a major HOA corruption scandal, they jumped on it instantly. Within a week, a local news channel aired a special investigative report titled "Abuse of Power: How a Texas HOA President Exploited Homeowners for Profit." The broadcast included a detailed breakdown of the financial fraud, exposing how Bob Langley had funneled tens of thousands of dollars into fake contracts tied to his own wife's consulting firm, testimonies from multiple homeowners who had been unjustly fined, threatened, and manipulated, Dane's security footage, including the failed frame job with the beer bottles and drugs, and HOA members sneaking onto his property at night. Legal experts explaining how several of HOA's actions violated state laws, opening the door for a class action lawsuit. By the time the segment ended, Bob Langley's name was trending on social media, and the HOA's corruption was the talk of the town. The day after the expose aired, something incredible happened. Homeowners who had been too afraid to speak out suddenly found their voices. A neighborhood-wide protest erupted outside the HOA office, residents holding signs that read HOA equals fraud and Where's our money, Bob? Zrenia gathered in force. Local reporters swarmed the scene, capturing every moment as the once untouchable HOA board was suddenly cornered by their own community. Inside, Bob Langley was in full panic mode. He had tried to deny everything at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Angry residents, reporters, and even lawyers looking to build cases against him. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse for Bob, the police showed up. Dane was standing near the protest when he spotted a pair of unmarked police vehicles pulling up. A group of uniformed officers, along with two plainclothes detectives, stepped out and marched straight into the HOA office. Minutes later, Bob Langley was led out in handcuffs. The crowd erupted into cheers. Dane didn't move. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching as the man who had spent months trying to break him was now being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. One of the detectives turned to the crowd and announced, "Robert Langley is being charged with embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. If you've been affected by his actions, please come forward to file a report." Dane gave a small, satisfied nod. Checkmate. The moment Bob Langley was shoved into the back of the police cruiser, Dane knew the war was almost over, but he wasn't the type to celebrate too early. Bob had spent years manipulating the system, and men like him didn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, within 24 hours, the HOA released a statement claiming that Bob's arrest was a misunderstanding and that he would fight the charges in court. Dane almost laughed. "Oh, you want to fight?" Dane had been preparing for this moment for months. Bob Langley was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and harassment, but his arrest was just the first domino to fall. The very next week, the HOA itself was hit with a class action lawsuit signed by over 40 homeowners who had been victims of its predatory fines and illegal practices. Dane wasn't just part of the lawsuit, he was the spearhead. At the first court hearing, his evidence became the backbone of the case. The judge watched security footage of Bob's enforcers sneaking onto Dane's property, listened to testimonies from homeowners who had been harassed, and reviewed financial records proving that HOA funds had been stolen and funneled into private accounts. And then, Dane played his final card. From the back of the courtroom, a new witness stepped forward, a former HOA accountant who had worked under Bob for years. She exposed everything. Fake maintenance projects that never happened, illegally raised HOA fees used for Bob's personal expenses, fabricated violation notices sent only to homeowners who opposed Bob's rule. By the time she was finished, the courtroom was dead silent. Bob's lawyer tried to argue that none of it was his fault, but the evidence was undeniable. The judge ruled that Bob was guilty on multiple counts of fraud and harassment. The HOA was dissolved, its assets frozen pending restitution payments to the homeowners. Bob Langley was sentenced to prison, and the entire corrupt board was forced out. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood began to heal. A new homeowners committee was formed, one that focused on actual community improvements, not greed. The first thing they did, they finally repaired the damn road. The day the construction crews arrived, Dane stood on his front porch, arms crossed, watching as the first layer of fresh asphalt was laid down. His neighbor, a man who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA, walked up to him and said, "I can't believe you did it." Dane smirked. "I told you, no one screws me over and gets away with it." And just like that, the war was over, and Dane had won. With Bob Langley behind bars and the corrupt HOA dismantled, the neighborhood felt like an entirely different place. The iron grip of intimidation, excessive fines, and fabricated violations had finally been broken, and for the first time in years, the residents could breathe freely. But Dane wasn't the type to simply walk away after winning a battle. He wanted to make sure no one could ever pull a power grab like this again. A temporary community meeting was called, and the turnout was unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up against Bob Langley were now standing side by side, demanding a say in how things were run. Dane took the floor, his presence commanding attention. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to make sure that what happened under Langley never happens again. No more fines for made-up violations. No more stolen money. No more intimidation. If we rebuild, we do it the right way." The crowd erupted in cheers and agreement. After a vote, it was decided that the HOA would not be reinstated, but instead replaced with a voluntary homeowners committee, where decisions were transparent, budgets were open for public review, and no single person had unchecked power. Every past violation issued under Bob Langley's rule was to be legally nullified, and all collected fines would be refunded. Any homeowner who had been forced to sell due to fraudulent HOA actions would receive compensation from the settlement fund. The meeting ended with a sense of unity that the neighborhood hadn't felt in years. While Bob Langley was rotting in a jail cell, the rest of his corrupt board members weren't getting off easy either. Several of them faced civil lawsuits, with their personal assets being seized to repay stolen HOA funds. Jerry Miller, the enforcer caught on Dane's security footage planting trash and drugs on his property, tried to skip town, but he was hit with multiple criminal charges for trespassing, fraud, and harassment. At the same time, a wave of public humiliation swept through the former HOA leadership. The local news continued to cover the fallout, and several former board members lost their jobs and social standing as their involvement in the scandal was exposed. Dane? He wasn't interested in revenge. Justice had already been served. The sound of construction equipment was the most beautiful thing Dane had heard in months. The very first thing the new homeowners committee approved was the long overdue road repairs. The cracks and potholes, once ignored under Bob Langley's rule, were now being filled in with fresh asphalt. The road that had symbolized corruption, neglect, and abuse was finally being restored. As the last of the repairs were completed, Dane stood with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the final layer of pavement settle. His neighbor, a retired veteran named Tom, approached and clapped him on the back. "You really did it, Hall," Tom said with a grin. Dane smirked. "I told them I wasn't going anywhere." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, knowing that the fight was over, and he had won. With the HOA officially dissolved and justice served, most people in the neighborhood considered the battle over. The corrupt board had been dismantled, stolen money was being repaid, and the long-neglected road was finally restored. But Dane Hall wasn't most people. To him, the fight wasn't truly over until he ensured that nothing like this could ever happen again. He knew how power worked, how a new group of opportunists could eventually rise from the ashes and reinstate the same cycle of corruption under a different name. He wasn't about to let that happen. Dane took one last trip to City Hall, armed with a final legal maneuver. He filed a petition to permanently revoke the HOA's charter, ensuring that it could never be reestablished in any form without a unanimous vote from every homeowner in the neighborhood. More than that, he pushed for a county ordinance that placed severe restrictions on future HOA formations, requiring full financial transparency, with quarterly independent audits made publicly available. A homeowner opt-out clause, preventing any HOA from forcing membership on residents who chose to remain independent. Severe legal consequences for any HOA board members caught engaging in fraud, intimidation, or harassment. When the ordinance passed, it sent shockwaves through the local HOA community. Other corrupt boards in surrounding neighborhoods took notice, realizing that their unchecked power might not last much longer. The final nail was officially driven into the coffin. A week after the dust had settled, Dane was in his garage when he heard a car pull up. He turned and saw a familiar face step out, Karen Langley, Bob's wife. For a moment, Dane tensed, half expecting another legal threat or plea for leniency, but to his surprise, she looked defeated. "I just came to say..." She hesitated, then sighed. "You were right, about all of it." Dane said nothing, waiting. I should have seen what Bob was doing a long time ago, she admitted, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. I didn't know the full extent, but I didn't ask either. I let him convince me it was all necessary. Dane studied her carefully. He wasn't the forgiving type, but he also wasn't interested in kicking someone who had already lost everything. You stood by and let him ruin people's lives, Dane said evenly. Karen's shoulders sagged. I know. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the hood of his truck. It's not much, but it's everything I could pull together. A personal contribution to the fund repaying homeowners. Dane stared at the envelope for a moment, then back at Karen. He didn't trust her, not fully, but he could see the weight of everything crashing down on her. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car, driving off without looking back. Dane picked up the envelope, opened it, and let out a low whistle. $20,000. A drop in the bucket compared to what her husband had stolen, but maybe a step in the right direction. The following weekend, Dane stood outside grilling steaks in his backyard. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to even speak against the HOA were now laughing, chatting, and sharing drinks. The entire neighborhood had changed, not just in law, but in spirit. At one point, his old neighbor Tom approached with a beer and nudged him. So what's next, Hall? You gonna run for mayor? Dane smirked, shaking his head. Nah, I think I've had enough politics for a lifetime. Tom chuckled. Well, whatever happens, we owe you one. Dane took a sip of his drink, looking out at the now peaceful, thriving community. Just don't let it happen again. And with that, he leaned back, knowing that he had not only won the battle, he had rewritten the rules entirely.